we're going to discuss, inshallah, relating this. But I also want to hear your thoughts on some of those questions. Are women putting themselves behind in Islamic education, or are they not given the opportunity? So if you think, this or that idea, you can go ahead and come forward. What is keeping women behind in learning Islam? I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on what is really keeping them behind. And of course, when we speak about those areas, I just want to make sure that I do this little short presentation just on the Muslim women and education and Muslim women, just so that we understand what Islam stands on that, in order for us to bring about a complete overview of what Islam says. So generally speaking, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, من عمل صالحا من ذكر أو أنثى وهو مؤمن فلنحيينه حياة طيبة ولنجزينهم أجرهم بأحسن ما كانوا يعملون. In general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we speak about acquiring ilm, it is part of amal. It is generally fard kifaya. Not everybody has to be a scholar, but we have to have a small or certain group of people presenting and teaching others that ilm. Yet, when we look at that being an action, there's definitely a higher reward for a scholar, a higher reward for a alim, and even within the communities, we always see that a alim is presented in an honorable position, or at least in different sciences. And in a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ did actually mention that كمل من الرجال كثير, that there were many men that were not necessarily perfect per se, but at least in a high rank. Yet amongst the women, there were only very few that reached that high rank. Mentioned Maryam bint Imran, and mentioned Asya, imra'at Fir'aun, Asya, Fir'aun's wife. And he mentioned the Sayyida Aisha as being, being in a higher rank than other women. And this hadith is actually in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. Now, when we look at those different areas, we know that in general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we see in that ayah, that whoever does good from male or female, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to reward them for it in the akhirah. And we know generally that the Prophet ﷺ actually says, إِنَّمَا النِّسَاءُ شَقَائِقُ الرِّجَالِ, that men or women are the brethren of men, meaning that it's not an issue of preference based on the person being male or female, but that is, in fiqh, in a qaida fiqhiyya actually says that al-ibra bi'umum al-lafz la bi-khusus al-sabab, that the main object for that particular quote that we quoted, which is that men are brethren for women and women are the men's brethren, is that although it was mentioned in a specific event, but the wording itself is applied in different instances and can also be applied in different instances as well, even if we're talking about the topic of education. Now, when we speak about women education, we know that there were many women companion scholars. We know that there was Aisha radiallahu anha, and Ibn al-Qayyim mentioned that there were a number of Sahaba that were close to 100, 130 that were considered as the highest in the top rank in being the scholars. And he said that that there were specifically 7 of them were considered at the highest rank, in other words, the best of all those. And he did mention, you could see that he had mentioned 7 of them, and he mentioned Aisha being one of the 7 most important scholars. At the same time, we see that Sayyidah Aisha herself actually narrated 2,210 hadith. And of course, she was considered the main important resource to teach about the private life, the Prophet ﷺ's private life. And they were not even shy to ask her on many issues, and in many very private issues. And she actually had taught over almost 299 Sahaba. 299 of the companions had learned directly from Sayyidah Aisha, and from them is 67 women. So you could see, although she was a woman, but you could see clearly that there were more men that were narrating from Sayyidah Aisha than women. So when we look at the Sahabiyat, we also see Salama. She was also one of those Sahabiyat that were the scholars. And in fact, she had narrated 101 hadith, 101 hadith. And or sorry, she narrated more than that, but from the Sahaba, there were 101 Sahabi that narrated from Salama, compared to 299 from Sayyidah Aisha, and 23 women. So again, we're seeing that pattern again, in where there's more men that narrated from one female teacher compared to women, 23 women, although she was a woman that was in a situation, there were more restrictions on the wives of the Prophet ﷺ on who they deal with, and there was the barrier that was kept there, that they were not supposed to go and actually meet person to person that is outside of their mahram group. Well, it wasn't just the area, the area of sahabiyat, the women's companions, but there was also the area of it, the area or the era of it tabi'in. So the word tabi'in, just to clarify, the tabi'in, a tabi'i is the person that met a companion, and the companion is the person that met the Prophet ﷺ. So you have many sahabiyat other than Sayyidah Aisha and also Salama, but you also have Asma bint Abi Bakr, you have Asma bint Umais, you have Juwayriyah bint al-Harith, Hafsa, Zainab bint Jahsh. Those were all women that were known to have narrated a number of hadith. Definitely not as many hadith as Sayyidah Aisha, but they were still there. And Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, in his book Taqrib al-Tahdhib, and in fact Tahdhib al-Tahdhib, Taqrib al-Tahdhib is a summary of Tahdhib al-Tahdhib, and Tahdhib al-Tahdhib is in approximately 12 volumes, yeah, almost 12 volumes. Taqrib al-Tahdhib um, is almost in, well, almost one fourth maybe. Well, you could have Taqrib al-Tahdhib depending on the copy, almost 2 volumes. You could have it in the very small font, but he had actually mentioned Taqrib al-Tahdhib. Now, not everybody mentioned in that book, to keep note, not everybody mentioned in that book, which acts as the profiles for all those that were ever mentioned in any hadith, that narrated a hadith, that narrated the hadiths. So not everybody that was mentioned in there is necessarily a scholar or is necessarily an acceptable resource. But Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani had actually mentioned 824 women, 824 women. And of course, we do have a number of other books that are considered profiles. So when we speak about these books, we're actually talking about profiles, whether it's Usd al-Ghaba or Tabaqat al-Kubra. Those were, or well, Ibn al-Athir is for Usd al-Ghaba. Those were basically books that compiled all the different names of the scholars and different different scholars of hadith or different narrators that had narrated hadith. So you could see that 824 of them were women, but the question is, so if we have 824 women, where did the rest go? We're going to talk about that later on, but really important, a very important thing to keep in mind is that there's a very important book. It's called A'lam al-Nisa for Umar Rida Kahala. You see, Umar Rida Kahala wanted in almost 5 volumes. Well, 4 volumes, and the fifth volume is basically, glossary and all that. But in his book A'lam al-Nisa, so he did a very important thing. Umar al-Kahala, he compiled all those names that were mentioned about women throughout history, whether this woman was a hadith, sahabiya, whether she was a singer, an author, a writer, any woman that was mentioned ever in the Muslim or the Arab in the Muslim or Arab history. He will actually mention her name, and we'll just add her name. But here's one thing, is that when you go through this book, by the way, I went through every single page in this book. When you go through the names, there are a number of things to note. Is number one, like I said, it almost has 3,000 people that were mentioned in it, almost 3,000 if I remember correctly. Out of the 3,000 names that were mentioned in there, you had the majority of the women were scholars in qira'at and Quran. So more of the oral transmission of ilm, the oral transmission of ilm. You had a large number, whether in Quran, qira'at, or hadith. And you also had a smaller number of women that were in fiqh. You had more women that were involved in hadith, in the oral transmission of ilm, than the type of ilm that involved, let's say, uh, debating or scholarly education, where it depended a lot on, give and take. Let's call it that way, where there's a circle of education. So if you look at the madhab Hanafi, for example, one of the main reasons why it was transmitted was because the Abu Hanifa himself was using the method of teaching and letting the students engage. There was a dialogue, there was a discussion, there was that. And yes, later, Dawla Uthmaniya was the one that, the Uthmani Khilafah was the one that embraced that madhab. But regardless, is that you could see that there was that engagement that helped this area grow. But it's really important to mention is that, the book A'lam al-Nisa, by the way, does not only mention scholars in Islam, but in fact mentioned a number of women, like I said, that they were singers or known to, what we call today as fasiq, the least to say, uh, as fasiqat, or probably lacking muru'ah, but still their names were mentioned. There were a number of books that did speak about uh, other women, and in hadith, just like when we look at, there's Juhud al-Mar'a fi Nashr al-Hadith, the women's academia in spreading hadith or teaching hadith, or even in Dimashq, in certain places. But here's one thing, is that most of these books did not really go outside of this book. Here's the thing, is that which is the book that I had mentioned earlier, although those scholars did compile those names, but they didn't really go farther than this book. And here's the thing, is that even though this is in 4 or 5 volumes, the amount of information is actually very small. The amount of information, it'll just talk about, very important notes about them, what they had, where they probably lived. You're not going to find stories, or at least that many stories, that you might expect or want to learn from, because anyways, that private life was really not known for women. And which is why, if we were to actually go to these books, they're pretty much going to, I would say, uh, quote the exact same thing that you would have in previous books. Which is what even A'lam al-Nisa had actually done. He just compiled from those different books and talked about the same exact information that we have in other books. But it's really important to mention is that a number of those scholars, those women scholars, did actually learn from women. When, just sifting really thoroughly within this book. And I'll tell you, I spent days just sifting through this book and reading this book. Yes, it's 4 volumes, but it was really important to sit through it to see what were women doing, what really happened. My main focus was to see whatever happened to the female authors. What really happened? Why didn't we hear about their writings? Where did it go? Well, there was another author that I came across. Sorry, I didn't have his book here, that I came across. His name is Muhammad Khairuddin Ramadan. Muhammad Khairuddin Ramadan, I'll write down his name. Muhammad Khairuddin Ramadan, he did actually try to compile those names, and he spent 5 years. I'm going to write down his name. He spent 5 years, Muhammad Khairuddin Ramadan. He spent 5 years in search of female authors. And he went through many books. He didn't necessarily, just want to, he didn't necessarily look for their manuscripts, but just wanted like the name of a book. That was enough. And after 5 years of search, he only came across 36 women that were authors, only 36 female authors that he was able to come across. So throughout 1,400 and some years, 36 female authors only, that brings a lot of questions. Why only 36 female authors? Where did everybody go? Did they just disappear? What really happened? So I came across a number of things. You do see, before I would see, well, what happened, a number of things that's really important to mention is that there were some major scholars that learned from women. So I'll give an example, like Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. Khatib al-Baghdadi, he actually has Tarikh Baghdad, is almost 20 volumes. And he himself says that he had learned from Al-Faqih al-Muhadditha, who we called Al-Faqih al-Muhadditha, Tahira bint Ahmed ibn Yusuf al-Tanukhiyya. So he did mention that he had learned from that Faqiha Muhadditha. Faqiha Muhadditha would mean that she was a scholar in Islamic legislature and also a scholar in Hadith. And he also mentioned that he learned from Amatul Wahid bint al-Husayn, that she had died in 377 Hijriya, and that she, according to what he said, was actually one of the best scholars in the Shafi'i madhab, and that she had the knowledge in the science of inheritance, in mathematics, and also in grammar. And he said that she even used to do fatwas, and the scholars, other scholars, were actually writing the words and what she was saying. In other words, she was a real scholar here. The other scholar was Jalila bint Ali ibn al-Hasan al-Shajari, and she was also one of those that was also going farther and actually traveling to seek ilm al-hadith. Was traveling to seek the knowledge and ilm al-hadith in Iraq, the Levant, Syria, and those. And she was even the teacher that was teaching scholars like As-Sam'ani. And one quote that I would like to note is that he said, "تُعَلِّمُ الصِّبْيَانَ الْقُرْآنَ الْكَرِيمَ," that she was teaching the young children Quran. Now, it's very important to mention that out of all the women that I came across in this book, I have not come across a woman that was, I would say, young to mean 30s, that was teaching men. All the women that I came across, I'm not here giving a fatwa, so just bear with me here. All the women that I came across, when they were acquiring the ilm, it was usually from men that were mahram to them. Very few were learning from outside of their maharim. Sometimes it was their husband, sometimes it was their grandfather, sometimes it was their uncle. And as for teaching, there were a number of women that were mentioned that they were in their late 40s that were teaching men, that they were actually teaching men, but not shawab. This is very important. I'm not here giving a fatwa, I'm here just laying out. And of course, note, laying out what was mentioned in A'lam al-Nisa can never be used as a reference for fatwa. Just a note. So you can't use A'lam al-Nisa and say, well, I went to A'lam al-Nisa and here's the fatwa that I'm going to issue. We don't issue fatwa from A'lam al-Nisa, but this is jar. This is more of describing what we come across and what was out there, and how was Islamic or women in Islamic history, how were they living and what was really happening. The other part is that when we see that a number of them were teaching, the names that were mentioned, just like Zainab bint Makki al-Harrani, that she was born or died 688. And by the way, I did do a lot of calculation where I had to see and figure out when that particular woman, not necessarily Zainab, but when these particular women were teaching, how old were they when they teaching at the time. Most of them, in fact, most of them were in their 60s and 70s, so pretty old. And I have not come across not a single one that was in her 20s or in her 30s. So I was doing my calculations and trying to see what age group and how did the community at the time accept it. There were a number of women that were mentioned that the students were actually lining up on her doorstep to learn hadith and even read. And the way that they were reading, or the way they were acquiring the ilm, is not necessarily the same way that we do it today, because there would be a lot of mutun. There was a lot of dependence on mutun. And what mutun are, they're instead of compiling all the explanation of one particular science, they would more do it in brief notes. And these brief notes, it could be a couple of pages. It's usually not that big. It's sometimes, you could have a matan that is almost 50 pages. You could have a matan 40, 30, and you can even have a matan that's probably 20 pages, but then the shuruhat can be, the explanations for that particular matan can be in volumes, 12 and 13 and 14 and 16 and 20 volumes. So you could have a matan that's pretty small, but it can have a lot of shuruhat. So the mutun, they were explaining the mutun. In other words, the matan, they were reading this matan, which is a couple of pages long, and those students were lining up. But it's very important to mention that there were a number of scholars that mentioned the name of Zainab al-Harrani, or al-Harrani, because al-Harran would be in Syria, and that Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, was also a very important scholar. Of course, wrote Sir A'lam al-Nubala. He actually said that she had a great lots of piety, let's say it that way. She was a pious, and she was also abida. She was more a spiritual person, lots of worship that she was doing, and that she loved narrating a hadith. In fact, even on the day that she was getting ready to die, in other words, on her deathbed, there were other students that were reading on her deathbed from those hadith. And of course, this was a woman that was older, by the way. It's really important to mention that. There were other scholars, Zainab bint Ahmad al-Dimashqiyya. So you had a number of women. But here's one thing, is that I realized that a lot of these women, like I said, it was more focused on oral transmission of Quran, Hadith, Tafsir, etc., and not the fiqh. We're gonna come across some, not only those, but a number of other ones. Asma bint Asad ibn al-Furat. Of course, Asad ibn al-Furat. Without him, you would not have had al-Madhab Maliki, at least a great part of it. And his own daughter was actually one of those major scholars in Al-Qayrawan in Tunisia, and she herself was present in a lot of those scientific and academic classes that her own father was doing, and she would at many times, according to Shahirat Tunisiyat, which is one of those books, it said that she was participating in asking questions, that she was participating in debating some issues, and also participating in mentioning and reading hadith and fiqh, etc., and that she had died in 250 Hijriya. Now, of course, it's very important to mention here is that when you look at these books, although I quoted it, most of what I had mentioned was actually quoted, so I won't be accused of plagiarism. I wanted to quote the exact same thing. Most of these were actually mentioned in the book A'lam an-Nisa, the one that I had mentioned before, which is this one, but I happened to find it easier when others had classified it in a way where it's easier for me to quote. You had a number of hadith scholars, just as Jawhara Naz al-Tamimiyya. And it was mentioned for a number of things, is that some of the scholars from Hurat, that they had actually learned from her. And one other part is that it's, I find it strange that at many times you had a number of scholars mentioning that, I learned from this female scholar, and this female scholar was a shaykha, was a main muhadditha, was a main faqiha, and of course that she had narrated a hadith books, etc. All those things were present. All those things were present. You could see it in those books, like Durar al-Kamina Ibn Hajar, where he actually said about Juwayriya al-Hakkari. Now, al-Hakkari would tell you that she was Kurdish. Al-Hakkari were all Kurdish. I used to live on Al-Hakkari Street in Jerusalem for some time, so I'm aware of Al-Hakkari and the details of that. So Juwayriya bint Ahmad al-Hakkari, she was a muhadditha, and again, we're looking at the oral transmission of ilm right there. So muhadditha would mean that she was a scholar of hadith, and she had heard the hadith from Abil Hasan ibn Sawaf, and I looked him up. He was not her mahram. So how were these durus, or how were these classes held? Was there any barrier, etc.? But just a note is that she was listening. She was listening to those classes, and later she حدثت بمسموعاتها. Later, she herself حدثت بمسموعاتها, meaning that whatever she had heard, she was qualified in order to transmit the ahadith that she had learned miraran. وعمرت فأكثروا عنها. And this is very important to mention. عمرت, meaning that she had lived a long life, meaning that she was old. فأكثروا عنها. And this could tell us that there were many students that learned from her, and of course, the older you get, the more students you're going to have. And you could see that because she got old, that actually made it easier for young men to learn from this scholar. Now, somebody else, of course, you could see muhadditha again, a number of muhaddithat, by the way. Muhadditha, again, a scholar of hadith from Naysabur, Uzbekistan, or Iran, and that she had come to Baghdad. So she had come to Baghdad and actually learned from a number of scholars. If I were to mention all these scholars, it's going to be hard for you to focus with me because they're just names to you. Al-Khallal, a scholar of tafsir, he actually said, كان أبو حامد الإسفراني يعظمها ويكرمها. That it was a scholar, his name is Abu Hamid al-Isfarani. He was somebody that was honoring her very many times. Now, the women were not only engaged in acquiring the ilm, but there were also a number of women that were also involved in building the institutions. And the most important institution is, number one, the institution that was built by Fatima al-Fihriya. Now, Fatima al-Fihriya, along with her sister, they had inherited a large amount of money from their father. And later, Fatima and Maryam, they basically built two most important universities at the time. The first one was in Qayrawan and in Qayrawan in Tunisia, and that was considered, Jami' al-Zaytunan, that was considered the most important university at the time. There was no other university except these two universities, which were built by Fatima al-Fihriya and also her sister Maryam al-Fihriya. And the building that institution started out in 245 Hijriya. But a very important note that I come across is that although it was women, it was these two women that had built those institutions, but there were 140 seats. 140 seats is not necessarily seat meaning chair, but it's like, little departments where they would be groups learning. 140 seats for men and only two for women, even though it was a woman that actually, or it was actually two women that built these institutions, but only two seats or departments were for women. All the rest were for men. So, something to talk about. The other part is that when we look at the public sphere, the wives of many leaders were building mosques under their names, and some of those that names that we had come across, and there's actually a lot more, but this is just a really fast summary. You could see a number of them were, the wives of kings, or the Khalifa, or the daughter of a Khalifa, or probably the sister of a sultan or a Khalifa, and where they went, where they built a school, just like in Madrasa al-Atabikiya, Dar al-Hadith al-Ashrafiyya, so that they built certain schools, they built certain schools, they built certain institutions for others to learn, um, Islam. But although that was the case, but they were not necessarily having many women attending. Why not many women attending? Well, we'll get to that, inshallah, and we'll also see your thought. There were some principals in a school. So you had Baraka bint Abdullah Sultan al-Ashraf, who was also a principal in a school. She herself Anshat. So Anshat would mean that she herself founded a school in the year 771 Hijrah, and it was Madrasa Bit Tabbana, so it was near Cairo. And in fact, she herself was teaching in it a specific dars to teach the Madhab Shafi'i, and a specific dars to teach Madhab al-Hanafi. And there was even a hawd ma'i lissabil. So there was even like a water fountain for others to drink, do wudu in, etc. And of course, she herself was also making different durus in the four different madhabs. And there was also a Sufi setting in it, and a specific area also for the orphans that were there. So this is just an example of, some women and what they engaged in, but it wasn't only those that were born and raised as Muslim women, but there were even some reverts. So you could see that Jariya bint al-Mu'ammal, and this is all, by the way, quoted from the book A'lam al-Nisa, which is the book that I had showed you earlier. Jariya, she had become Muslim, and of course, she was tortured for her deen, and later, um, later Abu Bakr as-Siddiq actually bought her and became one of the women to be known for what effort she put in keeping and preserving her faith. But it wasn't just that, but there's also Tahiyya Nubiya. Nubiya, so that would mean that she's from Nuba, meaning a woman that was from Sudan, or what is right now considered part of Sudan. But in Nuba is also part of southern Egypt. In southern Egypt, in other words, she was considered African and black, and she actually was mentioned in that her both of her parents were Christian, were taking her to church, and she was going with them to church. And later she was known to being the spiritual woman that later others would take as an inspiration. And even though, she was more of a person to herself, there were other women that were involved in writing, and women in writing were khattatat. Well, a khattata is more in calligraphy, so they were doing different calligraphy. And here I mentioned some of the names: Asma Ibrat bint Ahmed Agha, Hafiza bint Muhammad Saeed, and Badsha Khatun Tabinko. So you could see that most of these names are actually not Arabic names. And that's why sometimes it's hard for me to read them. Many of them were names for women that were considered as Ima. Ima meaning that they were slave women, or that they had a history of being slaves at one point, that later were freed, or probably they were from Al Mawali. It wasn't just only in those eras, but it was also in different places. You had some scholars were a number of scholars were actually in North Africa. In North Africa, from just a quick overview, North African women seem to be more involved in education than the Eastern women. What I mean by Eastern, meaning Al Iraq and meaning those areas. Now, this is just a quick uh, a quick thought that really requires more research. But from what I have seen and my observation, there were a lot more women that were engaged in scholarship and engaged in academia in North Africa. And what I mean by North Africa, I mean Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania, and and Hispania, or at the time Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus. There were a lot more women that were engaged specifically in Al-Andalus. There was a lot of scholars and female scholars in Al-Andalus than the women that you would find in Dimashq or Damascus, in Iraq, and in Iran. It doesn't mean that they weren't there. So we've got the scholar that was Benefsha bint Abdullah, that she was also a scholar, and she herself actually built the different rubat. Rubat are basically those areas where many Sufis would engage in their dhikr. So masajid, and even masajid, built masajid, and even built bridges, in Iraq. So let me see. And the other part is that Madrasat Bibab al-Azj. So she also built a school on the near the Euphrates River. Euphrates, or is it Dajla? All right, for the Hanbali scholars. Now, really important to mention, some of few women scholars were also teaching or even involved in dream interpretation. So Umar ibn al-Khattab would ask, for example, Asma bint Umais about certain dream interpretations and what certain dreams meant. And this is not me quoting, but this is actually here mentioned in Tabaqat ibn Sa'd, Al-Isaba ibn Hajar, Al-Mujtaba ibn al-Jawzi. So those are very important, those are important references. So when we actually speak about those references, those are academic references to prove that this actually happened. So this is not me, just bring it out of my mind, but this is something that was mentioned in many resources. There was a woman that I came across who was actually a midwife, Jalila bint Salih al Hakim. And they said قابلة فاضلة. قابلة means that she was a midwife. حبشية الأصل. She was originally Ethiopian. Ethiopian. أمها الطبيبة تمرهان. So her mother was a tabiba. Her mother was a medical doctor. And she was born in Egypt, and she learned midwife, how to be a midwife from her own mother. And later she was the medical teacher. In other words, the teacher and the teacher to teach medicine in Cairo. And she even had a book, okay, her book in midwife or OBGYN. Her book was محكم الدلالة في أعمال القبالة, and she died in Egypt, 1317. All right, and this is actually mentioned in Al-A'lam Lizirikli. Lizirikli was a Turkish scholar that combined all those different resources. There were other teachers from other places than the Arab world. A teacher from Sajistan, Jalila al-Shajariya. She was muhadditha qari'a al-Quran al-Karim. And you want to keep in mind is that the word muhadditha is different than qari'a, because a muhaddith is somebody that teaches hadith, but sorry about that. A muhaddith is somebody that teaches hadith, but a qari' lil Quran is somebody that teaches Quran. The other part that we need to, sorry about that, let me just, all right. So Jalila, like we mentioned right there, but there were other scholars as well. So let's also note from those scholars that were also not necessarily scholars, but engaged in other matters, which is Asma bint Makhrama or Mukharrima ibn Jandal. She was a fragrance businesswoman. So she was selling fragrances, which she was getting from Yemen, and she would sell it in Medina. She lived during the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, but that wasn't just her. Now, it's really important to mention that this is not, although it was mentioned, but the Al-Aghani al-Asbahani is not a resource that we would depend on at all in fiqh. But Tabaqat ibn Sa'd, we can use that as a reference. So just a note. So I won't be misquoted, and I'm trying to be as academic as I can. So there were other slave women that were becoming scholars as well. So you have Fadila, she was a mawla. When we say mawla, that would mean that she was an ex-slave woman. She was freed later on for Abi Mutarrif Abdul Rahman al-Qurtubi. She lived in Valencia, and she had learned grammar and اللغة العربية from her own master. And later, she actually became a lot more scholarly than her own master. And she actually became a master in al-arud. Al-arud is basically the art of learning the patterns for poetry. There are 16 different patterns of poetry, and they're called Bahr. And the Bahr is basically, there's a certain harmony for every single poem in Arabic. You can't just lay out a poem. And in English, there's that. In English, poetry is totally different. In Arabic, there is a Bahr. You have a certain you have a certain harmony that it must follow, and there are certain harmonies to make poetry. You don't just make poetry just because the ending of it sounds similar. No, there's a very specific science, and that's called al-arud. And she was even a scholar in memorizing different books in Lugha Arabiya, in Arabic language, and even though, remember, she was not necessarily Arabi. And later, of course, dies 450 year Hijriya. Now, there were other female scholars that were, just mentioned as scholars, that she was a scholar without going in detail, scholar in what. So they would say that she was a scholar, like the scholar right here. They just said عالمة فاضلة ولدت في أصفهان. She was born in Asfahan in Iran in 1308, and later she was اشتغلت بتحصيل العلم, would mean that she used all of her time to acquire ilm, and she became very good at it, and she had تألفت التصانيف, that she was an author for a number of different books, such as الأربعين الهاشمية, and another book called مخزن اللآلئ, and another book called النفحات الرحمانية والمعاد. So she was a scholar that wrote a number of books. Now, very important thing to mention is that this is part of A'lam al-Shia. This is part of the book that was mentioned in A'lam al-Shia. A'lam al-Shia, I'm here, you know, wanting to explain one thing, is that the Shias during that time are different than the Shias during our time. What was considered Tashayyu', what was considered Shi'ism at the time, was favoring Ali over Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, not the type of Shi'ism that is practiced today, in where it involves a lot of cursing for the Sahaba, or even speaking ill of the Sahaba. That was that was something that is becoming more of extremism in Tashayyu' today. But during that time, somebody can be part of al-A'lam Shia, can be part of a Shia, and still be considered, even a reference even for Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Just like Imam al-Bukhari himself actually had a number of scholars that he had learned from who were actually Shia. But remember, even though Nasa'i was accused of Shi'ism, and that was because he favored Ali ibn Abi Talib, but over Ali ibn Abi Talib over Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. But it doesn't mean that he engaged in the type of Shi'ism that we have today, which involves in a lot of disrespect for the Sahaba, or condescending the Sahaba in those different forms. So just to keep in mind when we speak about Shi'ism and what we actually mean by that. The other part, my screen. Sorry about that, but all of a sudden my screen's turned white. Okay. The other thing that I'd like to say is that there were a number of Shia scholars, or female Shia scholars, and I don't want to say more than women scholars, but there were a lot of Sufi women that were very famous and were mentioned in those books more probably than other groups of women. There was a lot of mentioning, and I'll tell you a funny story. When I was during my school first, my undergrad education, and I was very much involved in reading Kitab Sifat al-Safwa. Sifat al-Safwa is a 4-volumed book. And the weird thing about that book, you're going to laugh at me here, is that book was also always mentioning, Salihin and pious people, and how every single time that they were, like involved in dhikr and qiyam al-layl and in fasting and all that, and that how they later became those people that were getting miracles. And I was in my early undergrad, first and second year, and I was really hoping to go to Kulit Sharia and actually find saints there, but I didn't. So I started looking for the saints in the library. So I went to Sifat al-Safwa, which was that book that was compiled about those people, and they were always getting miracles. So for a whole year, I started engaging in every single thing about I was reading in that book. So I was doing, Qiyam al-Layl. I was reading. I was constantly doing dhikr. I was reading Qul Huwallahu Ahad like 1,000 times. I was every single day. I was, doing that hifz. I was Qiyam al-Layl, everything. I was like, okay, that's it. Pretty soon I'm gonna get a miracle or a karama, just like these people were getting karamat. When you live with these books, sometimes it just takes you into a different world. It just takes you into a different world where you expect that's it. I'm gonna get a karama soon. And I was reading about Mu'adha and all these women and all these men. They were men and women that were in these uh, or in that book, where they had a totally different lifestyle that compared to what lifestyle we have today. It doesn't mean that I had stopped, but when you live to read these books, especially the Sufi parts, there are some beautiful things, but many times when you engage in that lifestyle, you just get so addicted and you get hooked onto wanting, like, okay, I'm just waiting for a miracle, without you realizing that that's not the end of it, and that's not the whole purpose to engage in all that dhikr. I don't know why I mentioned this, but I guess I just saw that Sophia part. All right, so the other part is that yep, that's why I said Sophia, because a number of them were actually part of a Sophia and Tasawwuf were considered major issues throughout different times of history, because Sophia, it is more, that spiritual connection that was involving a different type of spiritual development. Now, generally speaking, there definitely was more than just within Sufism, because you also had a number of women that were also engaged in writing, such as writing the Quran, or writing or rewriting certain books, because at the time, of course, they didn't have printing. So the only printing that was there was actually the reprinting the books by hand. It was just all manual. I came across, and I wish I can find it right now, but I came across one a manuscript one time. In this manuscript, I wish I even though I saved it, but I couldn't find it for our class today. The manuscript, um, at the end of it, so the manuscript would have like who the author is in the beginning, and then at the end who the person that wrote this or rewrote it or printed it in today's terms. And at the end of the book, she said, "Please excuse any mistake that I had um, may or I may have committed in this book, because I was holding and writing the book in one hand, and I was and I was shaking, or moving my son with the other hand." So she was struggling, trying to keep her son quiet as she writes. So she would, I guess, trying to swing her child and keep him quiet, and she would write with another hand. And that's why she would ask us to dismiss some of those typos that she might have gotten into. And that, when I read it, it really touched me, because I'm a mother. And when you're a mother, I mean, I don't, my husband, alhamdulillah, he's a great man, but I'll tell you, it is so hard when you're a mother. It is so hard to engage in writing and in work on scholarly things, because it requires a lot of time, and to keep your children understand that you're busy with what you're doing. It is extremely hard. Not always does the child understand at that moment that you're engaging and you're busy with something far more dangerous than a lollipop. So it's, just when I read it, I felt that, you know, I understood what she was talking about. Not many people will understand it, but I loved it. Why have not why have we not heard of the female scholars? A number of things to mention is that when we speak about women's scholarship, for others to grow, in order for you to grow academically, and others even, for you to engage in other words, to teach others, you need to be public. You're going to eventually be public, whether you're going to go to scholars to learn from them or whether you're going to teach others. That's the only way that people will know about you. Is it the most important thing? So why is people knowing about you important after all? It's not in itself important, but when we speak about ilm, transmitting the ilm can only happen when you are at the, under the feet of scholars, or at least teaching others. And that's the only way that you pass on ilm. So the ilm is not, if it's confined in your mind, good for you, but how is it going to benefit the public? um, in order to transmit the ilm, or even get the ilm, you're going to need to be public. You're going to engage with others, and engaging and even traveling to get the ilm was definitely not easy for women, because traveling at the time in itself was hard, let alone having the mahram. So it's not just the issue of having a mahram, but traveling in itself was very hard on women. They were getting pregnant, of course. Their bodies are not as strong. It's not as strong in men. I mean, even men I mean, the Prophet ﷺ actually said that is safar qit'atun min adab. Traveling is a portion of punishment, a portion of torture. So how is it when we are, as women, that it was going to be easy, or even available for us to do those kind of traveling? Because if you are a woman and you're able to travel, well, your son is definitely going to be exposed to more tiring environments and situations that your child may not be able to endure. And in teaching others, public and teaching others, that was also another obstacle. And where, how is she going to be teaching others and engage in teaching others she herself when she herself is probably young, or maybe having some certain responsibilities? So all those different areas were also making it hard on her. And of course, the other part is that when we talk about Islamic academia, it involves more than just teaching. Because it's kind of like when we're talking about medical doctors. When you learn the medical studies, the place of implementation is really in a hospital. That's the same thing when we speak about, when you learn Islam, the place where you're going to teach it to others, or at least put it into practice, is really in court. And women, it was really hard for women to get into court and get into that system, because it required a number of conditions. Public engagement with other scholars was also hard, because you would need others to accompany you. It was hard to be with those other scholars, and unless it was your own father. Just like, for example, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, one very important scholar who was a student in the beginning, learning from his own sister, even though his father was also a scholar. But his sister was the main teacher for him, and his sister was the beginning of that scholarly transmission. And then later, his Ibn Hajar's wife, daughter, and also, well, daughters, he only had one boy, or actually he had, Ibn Hajar Asqalani actually had 10, and they all died, and only one later lived until the age of 10. And when he celebrated, not birthday, but celebrated that he did not die, but then the second day he died. Subhanallah, something we just think that those scholars did not go through hardship. How public were some women is the question. Well, when we look at a number of different resources, we could see that Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, for example, in his book Al-Mu'jam Mu'assas al-Mu'jam al-Fahras, he had actually mentioned, and this is Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the guy that I was telling you about in just a bit. He actually mentioned that he had a number of his teachers uh, that he himself learned from. So a number of female teachers, and he actually had described some of them, and specifically described Aisha bint Abdullah al-Halabiyya. Aisha bint Abdullah al-Halabiyya. Halabiyya means she was from Halab, from Syria. And the same person, Imam al-Dhahabi, also mentioned her in Mu'jam Shuyukh al-Dhahabi, and he also mentioned a number of other shuyukh. And by the way, al-Dhahabi is one of those major scholars. He wrote one of my favorite books. It's called Sir A'lam al-Nubala. Sir A'lam al-Nubala, I wish it can get translated. It's an almost 18 volumes. Yeah, 17, 18 volumes. Well, the last two volumes are actually those, the the, the Fahras, the Fahrasa and all the glossary and stuff. But uh, the Sir A'lam al-Nubala, it actually tells you all these beautiful stories. The word Sir A'lam al-Nubala means the biography of the most noble men. Maybe it is translated, but biography of the most noble men. And he used to mention it many times. Tuwufiyat shaykhatuna. Our shaykha had died. Let me comment on the word shaykha. It is so sad to uh, to see that there was more misogyny in women to refuse the term sheikha than than men. I remember there was a time where some of the girls that were coming to my classes will tell other women, and the there was a number of times where the response from other girls, they said that there's no such thing as a sheikha, and that is a bid'ah, and that women cannot teach Islam, and that is an innovation. So you could see, until now, it's so sad to see that there's misogyny even within our own selves. Allahul Musta'an. There was also Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi. Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, one of those major scholars that learned from women. In fact, he had more women scholars than male scholars. Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, male scholars, of course, during his young and early age. That's when he had more women scholars, and they were his main teachers. And the teachers that were teaching Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi were the bondswomen. Although generally they were bondswomen, and Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi happened to be very fortunate because his own father was was considered like a mayor. So because he was a mayor, he was very fortunate, and the women in Al-Andalus, in that castle, were the ones to teach him Quran, were the ones to teach him writing, reading, poetry, and he even stayed under their supervision until he had reached the age of puberty. And he was always saying, "Rubbitu fi hijr nisa," that I was I was disciplined, or I grew up in hijr nisa, like in women dorms. And وَنَشَأْتُ بَيْنَ أَيْدِيهِنْ, and I grew up, between them. And I did not know other than them. وَلَا جَلَسْتُ الرِّجَالِ إِلَّا وَأَنَا فِي حَدِّ الشَّبَابِ. He said, I did not even sit with the men until I reached the age of shabab, until I reached the age of puberty. And, shabab meaning late, well, shabab is more like late teenage. And they're the ones that taught me Quran, and they're the ones that actually taught me poetry, and they even taught me how to write. And of course, later Ibn Hazm had it was actually one of the most important scholars to always defend women's scholarship, just to keep note. And ironically, he was I think he's the only scholar to say that Sayyida Maryam was actually a prophet. All scholars disagreed with him. And Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, one of my favorite scholars, it used to be said Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, Lisan Ibn Hazm and Sayf al-Hajjaji Qurna, that they're shaqiqan or Qurna, meaning the Sayf al-Hajjaj. Sayf al-Hajjaj al-Hajjaj, Ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi, he was a very, what is the word that I could use, but a very, what is the word that they used to use against Saddam Hussein? Dictator. Okay, yeah. What's his name? Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi was indeed a dictator. Um, and and he was always known, although he did a lot of good advancements. So don't just think that he's a dictator without any advancements, but he had a lot of different things. In fact, a lot of scholars said that there was an ijma' that this man was fasiq, but he had a lot of good advancements as well. Part of them is ordering that they would have dots on the Quran for others to make sure that others don't read the Quran wrong. Uh, Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi was said that his own tongue and also the sword of al-Hajjaj, that dictator, are Qurana, like they are the same. That they're actually the same. It's like saying this, the sword with two ends, with two edges. Um, and Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi would often, you could see the anger and the tension many times revealed in his writings when he would write about other scholars, including Shafi'i and Imam Malik, and he was really intense with his books. Um, so is that something that he got out of women, that sometimes they can get tensed? Perhaps, I have no idea. Something to, just, I don't know, I just had to say that on a side. Suyuti. Suyuti, and we mentioned before, died 911 Hijriya, 911 Hijra, and he also took the scholar, was also learned from Hani bint al-Hurini. She was also one of those scholars, and he actually learned from her in Nahu, Arabic grammar, and he also had mentioned her in his book, بغية الوعاء في أخبار النحاة. بغية الوعاء, بغية الوعاء, it's like for those that want to be aware on the information in the news of the scholars of grammar. And he also mentioned al-Fadl al-Maqdisi. al-Fadl was one of those scholars that taught him. Khadija bint Abi al-Hasan, Nashwan bint Abd al-Kinani, Hajar bint Muhammad al-Misriya, Amat al-Khaliq, and he also mentioned other names. So just something to mention. There were some political engagement that some women were engaged in, but really important to mention, although there was some political engagement, but it was always very limited. It was always very limited, and many times that political engagement didn't go far. The farthest that any political engagement went was with Shajarat al-Dur. So Shajarat al-Dur, she ruled, although 80 days in Egypt, and engaged in two major battles. It's not that she literally engaged, but she gave the orders and defeated, at the time, during the same period, defeated the Byzantine, well, not the Byzantine, sorry, the Crusaders, and also defeated during the same time the Mongols during the same time. So that was by her giving that order, and that was that was the farthest that any woman could get. But later, because it was not acceptable that women would get to that level of leadership, that also led to toppling her own uh, toppling her own leadership. But it is very important to just to also be fair and subjective in the word that I just said. It wasn't only because the community did not accept or consider that it was allowed for women to be in that position, but it was also because she was involved in killing her own husband, who had married a second wife. So yeah, sometimes can go far in a different way. The other the other political engagement that I wanted to mention was Fatima bint Muhammad al-Samarqandi. And what I mean by political engagement here, not necessarily political to mean where she's leading directly, but here it was mentioned that Nur al-Din, al-Malik al-Adil, Nur al-Din would many times actually ask her on many issues on fiqh, even though her husband, and by the way, her father was a great scholar, and her husband Al-Kasani was one of the scholars of Hanafi, his Hanafi scholars. He wrote a book which was considered one of the most important books. It's called Bada'i al-Sana'a. Bada'i al-Sana'a, it's a 6-volumed book. Bada'i al-Sana'a in Madhab al-Hanafi. It's the most important, one of the most important, let's say it that way, in the books of Madhab al-Hanafi. But his wife, Fatima bint Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Samarqandi, who later, it's like her father was a scholar, and she later married the student, her father's student. All right. And later but I didn't even know it was mentioned here. And later she would also engage in a lot of the fatwa regarding political matters, or even regarding, let's say, governance. And that was Nuruddin Mahmud Zinki. He would be the king who was many times asking her on those matters. And of course, many others to mention. I'm going to go into spiritual engagement. I mentioned before that there were a number of women that were engaged in tasawwuf, in Sufism. And the Sufism that was at the time is not like the type of Sufism that we have today, in where it's involved in a lot of lacking ilm. Unfortunately, it's very sad to say that a lot of the Sufi groups today, they actually lack ilm and more engage in a very surface understanding of spirituality. But during that time, no, they actually had the ilm, and they also were engaging in those in that Sufi tazkiyah lifestyle. So she was actually part of a sha'irat. She was a poet, and she would mention a lot of poetry regarding to different matters. And she was also mentioned that she was لها عدد غير قليل من المصنفات, that she had a number of books, and الدواوين and القصائد الصوفية. So here we're seeing another woman in here, Aisha al-Ba'uniyya, that she had other books that she had written. Did we get any of these? We didn't actually get them, at least not many, just as we have millions, and I mean millions, of manuscripts that are right now found in France or even in Germany. But unfortunately, Muslims right now are not getting access to these, not getting access because they're not allowing you access, but unfortunately many Muslims are very very unaware of their own tradition. When you're unaware of your own tradition, you're unaware of your own identity. When you're unaware of your own identity, that's when you lose your confidence in your tradition, you lose confidence in your Islam, you lose confidence and unfortunately, our identity is preserved by a lot of those libraries in Germany, in Holland, in Leiden, in Germany, and in UK. And unfortunately, Muslims right now are preferring to stay away from academia, and we're still getting there. Let's just be a little bit positive. Being public at many times contradicted a lot of the different areas in a woman's life, social life, because many of them were busy with motherhood, were busy as wives, and also the spiritual growth. There were a number of women that considered that وَقَرْنَ فِي بِيُوتِكُنْ, the ayah that is in Surah Al-Ahzab, that was here, that was ordering the wives of the Prophet ﷺ to stay within their homes, to stay within their homes. A number of women took it that it was العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب, that the object here is not necessarily when it was recited and when it was revealed and whom it was referring to, but it was referring to all women. So that made a number of women distance themselves in that public atmosphere from the public atmosphere that involved a lot of intermingling with men. And of course, men would have more of the ilm, just like when we saw that out of 299, well, you had 299 men that narrated from Sayyidah Aisha, but only, I believe, 69 women narrated for, or 63 women that narrated from Sayyidah Aisha. So, and 101 from Salama versus 23 women that narrated from Salama and 101 men. So you could see that to transmit the ilm wasn't always there from women. The biological creation centered, for women around a lot around their motherhood, nursing, taking care of the child, needed lots of supervision, although not necessarily a justification, but that was a priority. And when you have that as a priority, it makes it harder to do other matters, especially that, of course, at the time they did not have the contraceptives that we have today. Not that I encourage using contraceptives, but it's something that we have to put in perspective before we start judging what really happened and whether there was a lot of misogyny involved or whether that was really a certain biological part in a reality within a woman's life that may have affected different works and different capacities and potentials to be put in other areas. There was also a time is a price to pay to fulfill motherhood job. So it wasn't at all easy to engage in that. Although, even if you don't become a scholar, in the end, is that seeking ilm requires sincerity, managing time, and taqwa. And remember, even if you don't necessarily become a scholar, acquiring ilm in itself is actually dhikr. So don't make acquiring ilm to prove yourself to others. It's not a race here that I want to race with the men and all that. Although I am aware that at many times there can be some certain institutions that may disregard women's academia and women's scholarship. You don't necessarily, and we don't as women, have to go through male institutions. Make your own institutions, sisters. Make your own institutions, and bring about those female scholars, male scholars, whatever and make sure that you engage in teaching ilm in a way that raises your rank in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't worry and don't make your goal to prove it to the men. This idea that we're here involved to prove it to the men, that women can be as men, is a very feminist rhetoric. It's a very feminist rhetoric. Don't engage in that. As a Muslim woman, you 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 don't prove it to others. You don't prove it to people, because the Prophet ﷺ in a hadith in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, the Prophet ﷺ actually said that four people, uh, they can acquire ilm for four reasons, and even enter hellfire for it. And he mentioned that one, they just want to acquire ilm ليماري به السفهاء, just wants to acquire ilm in order to boost and in order to show off for others, or in order to debate others and prove to others that they are better. Or other people that that might actually just do it for the sake of fame. You don't engage in ilm to do that. And when you engage in ilm to do that, you just lost your akhirah. How worth is it really worth it? You just lost your akhirah. Engage in ilm for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Engage in ilm in order to do that part, which العلماء ورثة الأنبياء, scholars are basically the ones to inherit the prophets. When we talk about inheriting the prophets, it's inheriting the ilm. It's inheriting that it's a trace that traces back to the prophets and messengers, and traces back to the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent unto all people. That's all that matters. What people think of you, and to do that type of competition with men is jahiliyyah. Let's say it that way. Is jahiliyyah. These women that we had mentioned before, their main goal was not to, it was not to race or to condescend men, because they knew that they had one goal to work on, and that is to deliver the message, that is to bring about guidance. And once you keep that in your heart, that in itself is sincerity. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيَعَلِّمْكُمُ اللَّهُ. Have taqwa, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be the one to teach you. But time management is really important. I'm going to hear in Egyptian language, Shaykha doesn't have a good meaning. In Morocco, too, growing up was used in a bad meaning. Do you think that can be a reason why women reject the title? This is a question. You know, it can be. I don't know the context in the Egyptian language. I know that the word shaykha, I know that in the Egyptian culture that doesn't have a good connotation. Can it be a reason why women reject the title? It can be, it can be, but I don't necessarily know. You know, I have no idea what and where that connotation comes from. So I can't answer that question, because I have no idea why, from a time where the word shaykha had a good connotation, to later having a very bad connotation. But does that mean it comes from the movies? I have no idea. I don't know. So, you know, that's all I could say. This is part of, you know, طلب العلم, is that you learn how to say I don't know. I don't know. I think it's worth studying. Here's another question. Somebody is happy about Senegal, West Africa. Yes, Senegal, Senegal, West Africa, and Mauritania specifically. There were a number of great scholars that were in qira'at, and uh, in our modern times, there are a number of scholars. One of them is Muhammad ibn Hassan Wild Dadu. He actually mentioned that his first teacher was actually his own mother, and there were a number of scholars that that were taught by their own mothers, and later they will always mention that it was, if it wasn't for their mothers, they would have not have made it. So if we're talking about Muhammad ibn al-Hasan wal-Dadu saying that his mother was his first teacher, yes, you can grow to be more scholarly than your own teacher, but definitely we're not getting access to those great scholars, and who can later be the women to teach other women as well. When I when I founded Gems of Light, I was really looking for female scholars, and I worked really hard to look for female scholars to get on board. A number of female scholars refused to be public and wanted to make sure that the women that were hearing the classes were only women, and that there weren't any men in the background, etc. And that was almost, well, that was going to be impossible. And of course, a number of other women refused that they would be teaching in other than person to person, and only women. And I wasn't going to be able to bring all those women. The other part is that a number of women they refused to join along because they were very convinced that they should not be getting paid. They were very convinced that they should not be getting paid, and they needed to seek other jobs. And they didn't then eventually, well, if you're going to have a job and you're working a full-time job and you're also a mother, you're not going to be able to have the time to actually teach Islam. So unfortunately, within our communities, paying a Quran or an Islamic studies teacher is still considered as you should not be getting, and that this should be a volunteer work. And this will have negative outcomes, because if the Islamic studies scholar or teacher is going to be doing a full-time job in other matters, then they're not going to be able to deliver the ilm in Quran, Hadith, whatever it is in the Islamic studies, because those teachers will not have the time. And if you're not going to sustain them financially, they're not going to be able to be sustained in terms of time, or even have the potential or the power or the energy to engage in any of this. So, I think sometimes we also have to engage in a number of talks to see. In our modern times, I must also admit, you know, men tend to be a lot more educated, at least in Islamic studies, than women. There's a huge difference. There's a huge gap between the level of Islamic studies education in men compared to women. It's very sad to mention that it doesn't mean that there aren't any scholarly women. There are. Many times they're not engaged in public for a number of reasons, like I mentioned before, but uh, there is also that barrier from women even getting into a lot of those institutions. And let's go ahead with the poll and actually see. Actually, there's a question. How do we understand Kamula? What are the qualities that are required, since only 4 women, but men may acquire it? That's a very, very good question. When we talk about il-Kamal, the Prophet ﷺ actually said that that he is that he is the well he was how can we translate it, but that he had akhlaq, that he akhlaq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually said, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, that you are in a great akhlaq. And the Prophet ﷺ said that he was actually perfected. And when he's then he explained that in order to be perfect, that you would have to have the akhlaq, that there were akhlaq al-anbiya. And he had mentioned that there's going to be khair in the ummah still remaining. And the khair in the ummah is split. So each and every single one will have a portion. You might have a scholar that might be gentle, another scholar might have the ilm, another scholar might have the spirituality, another scholar might have another portion of Islam, good portion of Islam, etc. But very there's more there were more men that would have a number of these portions than women. Is it necessarily a biological thing? Is it necessarily a biological thing, or is it something that also involves the dynamics of our social life? But what we can do to at least acquire some of that is to acquire and embrace akhlaq al-nubuwah. It starts with embracing the manners of al-nubuwah, manners of the Prophet ﷺ, the akhlaq that the Prophet ﷺ himself had practiced. That's the beginning of it. And then to implement it without getting into that shatahat, in those moments where many times as women we might slip in those moments maybe due to hormonal changes, due to different things. It doesn't mean that we're not mukallaf, by the way. It doesn't mean you're not held accountable. You're still going to be held accountable, even if you go through those hormonal changes, because taklif is related to your mind, not to your hormones. All right, taklif is related to your mind, and the taklif that you're held accountable is going to be determined based on your ability to, one, al-aql is mind, determination, and all that. And many times you could see that women are more prone. This is not me being misogynist. This is not me being misogynist. This is just a general observation. This is not having self-hatred. But it seems many times we are more prone as women to, um, what is the word that I could use? Maybe to let our inclinations, at least our anger, our temper, to sometimes get out of hand, um, and that's when we lose our determination. And this is the word aql. Aql doesn't mean intelligence, but being sober, being balanced. So I think it's really important for us to work on that and do some time management and consider uh, what am I supposed to be determined on, and how to be consistent. How to be consistent, how to be determined, how not to let those hormonal imbalances sometimes control our consistence, well, our enthusiasm, and to let us stay focused. It doesn't mean, it's very sad to say that we could see there are more scholars in medical studies, even though it's harder to get to than actually Islamic studies. We barely have women in Islamic studies, or women that are scholarly in Islamic studies, and it's usually disregarded as something. Well, you could just learn it later. You can learn it on your own. So just something to think about, in where, what do we really need? How to get to that? I think it starts with al-aql. It starts with al-aql. It starts with akhlaq. So there are a number of sides to it. I think I would still have to think more about the question, but that's a very good question. So if there are any other questions, we're going to look at the poll. Okay, we're going to end the poll right now, and we're just going to share the results, so you guys can see the results right now. All right, here we go. So the results: what is keeping women from acquiring ilm in Islam? So we had 53% say it's the children, and 29% said it's the husbands. All right, and money and other 53%. So the children, I think I agree with that one. The husbands can sometimes be an obstacle, and that's why I always say, if you want to, acquire ilm, make sure you find a husband that is also giving ilm and acquiring ilm time, because they will not understand what acquiring ilm and the importance of acquiring ilm and what the amount of time it needs, unless they themselves are engaged in it. And they understand the importance of having an educated wife as well. Let's see, women have the time to educate. It's a matter of doing the right thing. 94% said yes. I love the answer. It's a matter of doing the right thing. And only 6%, only 1% said no. They don't have the time to educate. That's all right. Do you trust female scholars or more male scholars? 53% said they trust more male scholars. I agree with you on that, unfortunately. And there are a number of reasons. And 47% said that they trust female scholars. All right. So anybody wants to share anything before we end this poll? You want to raise your hand or even, participate in talking about this, go ahead. I know I did most of the talking, by the way. I'm sorry, but I thought it was, I did not expect that it would take that long, and I did not expect it to go for, what, an hour and a half? I'm so sorry about that. I expected it to take half an hour only. So if anybody wants to say anything, probably answer some of those questions or tell us what you think about it. Go ahead. Binta. All right, Sister Binta, go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Aisha, my question is, so you were talking about the title Sheikha. So what do um, scholars, female scholars, prefer to be called from your point of view?
Well, it's not an issue of what you label the person, because al-ilm is not about how you label the person, and it's not how the public label the person. It's when you want to define a scholar, uh, it's not the layman that define al-alim. It's basically the other scholars that testify that that person has the ilm. All right. So it's the other ulama that will say that that person has the ilm, and not the layman. But the reason why at many times it's important to, and I still would encourage the women scholars to also use shaykha as a term, is really just to help identify who is specialized in Islamic studies, in order to be able to be found amongst the rest of the crowd, to help answer the question. So that's just a tool. That's not a term of honor. It's not a term of honor. It's a name and a label, just to help others know who is specialized in Islam, in order to help identify those that are specialized in those fields. Just like, for example, when you go to a clinic, it's not that they have a doctor and a nurse, an MD and an RN as an honor or to condescend an RN, but that's in order to help those that are coming in know who is qualified in what. So it's to represent qualification. It's to represent qualification and not a place of honor. So as long as we understand that uh, that tool and what it refers to, I think then it's important to make sure that we let the others know who is qualified to answer those questions. One thing is that there are many words that people will use, ustada, shaykha, etc. But and some will debate what is an ustada, what is a shaykha. This is more of a modern thing. It's a modern label, and it's the word ustada and shaykha. That wasn't something that was used in the past. Shaykha, yes, but a sheikh was, at the time, the sheikh was considered, like what we say today as a professor. That was the sheikh at the time. It was like the top. That was the top professors. That was the sheikh. And right now, the term sheikha, unfortunately, we have a lot of people that graduated from. We have a lot of people that graduated from institutions that more are very similar to what we today call ESL, English Student Learning, where it is this type of education that is kind of like an associate degree, and will later be called, in our times, called shaykha, and many times the person themselves will say, well, I'm a shaykha, I'm this. But like I said, it's not it's not a term of honor. And unfortunately, in our times, Islamic studies education was really hijacked by many. So somebody can take probably a number of courses, or probably go to Syria, or probably go to Egypt and take a few classes in Islamic studies, and all of a sudden they become those women to give fatwa, even though they're not qualified to do that at all. But unfortunately, uh, they would be put in those positions, and later I would consider that that becomes a misleading area, because it's an amana. It's an amana. You, not because a person took 3 or 4 courses, or even a number of courses in Syria, Jordan, or Egypt, or Pakistan, it doesn't make them qualified to give fatwa. It's very sad to mention that the Islamic education was very hijacked from the Muslim Ummah itself. The Muslim Ummah itself let others, and let those that are not qualified, hijack the Islamic studies academia. So I probably went off track. I did write an article one time about the hijacking of Islamic studies, in where somebody, that probably, like I said, is not qualified, can they themselves label themselves sheikh, sheikha, etc., and then all of a sudden, the masses, they they don't go over to see whether that person is qualified or not. And that's why degrees are really important. And somebody right now, the word ijaza, somebody can say, "Oh, I've got an ijaza," when right now the term ijaza is many times misused. And somebody can say they've got an ijaza in Quran, and ijaza in Quran would mean that they just read the Quran, and maybe the ijaza was granted because they read a number of pages, and then later become the teachers, and later become those people to be a to many, uh, put put on a pedestal, in order, and people will see them as qualified shuyukh to deliver Islam. This is really sad, really, because if the person is not qualified, this is an amana. And you don't go for you don't take a prescription from anybody, but there is a medical institution, there are institutions that will overlook all the different degrees, all the different qualifications. But unfortunately, in Islamic studies right now, it had really lost a center to overlook who is qualified and who is not qualified, where we're getting people that are not qualified right now teach Islam and make their own nonprofit organizations, institutions, you name it, even though they're not qualified. But they got likes, they got that public acceptance. They were, what is the word that I could use? They were eloquent, and people liked them. And then later, people started recognizing them as scholars, even though they just learned on their own. They didn't really have any scholars that reviewed their scholarly work, and are they qualified or not. Nasallallahu al-afwa wal-afiyah. Um, a question says, do we have an Islamic headquarters that watch and review all those titles, or do we need to create one? So we don't have Islamic headquarters, but that review all those titles, but we do have the Islamic headquarters right now, and that's why I would say review, uh, review meaning the Islamic institutions, maybe Al-Azhar, maybe Al-Qura, maybe the Islamic University in Malaysia, so or different universities, and where you would make sure that that person actually has a degree from an Islamic headquarter. And the 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 degree itself will tell you their ability to do different things. So if a person is an undergrad, they just learned how to understand the books, but not necessarily research in those books, those Islamic books. When you go for your master's, then you're in the beginning of learning how to research in those Islamic studies books, in fiqh and hadith, etc. And you are just in the beginning. Once you get your PhD, that's when other scholars, other scholars will review your work and then testify that you are capable of researching and capable of understanding what you are researching in Islamic studies. But even if you have a PhD in Islamic studies, it doesn't necessarily make you a scholar, because a PhD is just a reflection on your, let's say, research capacity, but not on how much you know. You can have a PhD and not be a scholar. You can, because you, when you took your PhD, you researched a certain matter and you mastered researching that certain matter, and it was reviewed by other scholars on that specific matter. But it doesn't make you a scholar on every single matter in Islamic studies, even if you have a PhD. Here's another question. What about not what about that not all those graduate from Al-Azhar are Islamically correct, and what are they teaching? So it's not just Al-Azhar, it's other institutions as well. So it doesn't have to be only Al-Azhar. It can happen that other scholars and are real scholars that can also slip, even if this person was indeed, Ra'is al-Azhar nafsu, the head of the Azhar itself. It's not just Al-Azhar, but it's also Al-Qura, it's also Al-Madina, etc. So when we talk about political issues, um, there are a number of things that are required from a alim. It's not just the ilm itself, but it's also the courage to say the truth. And that's that part of integrity, that taqwa, uh, that's a different part of it. You can have the ilm, which everybody will witness that you have the ilm. But does everybody have the integrity, the taqwa, the religion, the piety to say the truth despite all the political / philosophical challenges that we are in during our time? Not everybody has that. You can have a lot of scholars. I mean, I don't want to name names right now, but you can have a lot of scholars that know the truth, but are willing to manipulate or twist the truth because probably they were not courageous enough to say the truth, or probably because they didn't have the taqwa to say the truth regarding so many different issues. And right now in our time where scholars are being imprisoned, scholars are being forced to change the fatwa, or if you don't change it, face the prosecution. It starts out with all those language prosecutions, the labeling, the threats, all those different sides, and probably face even uh, the the different institutions to not recognize you because they are in fear of getting isolated or rejected or their license rejected, etc. So we're looking at different challenges here. It's not easy. It's not easy. So somebody can be a scholar, but that makes it even more challenging on the layman on who I should consider. Well, it's not enough to just look at the degree, but you need more to get the ilm, to make sure that these scholars are with ilm, with deen, to actually say the haqq. And jazakumullah khairan, everybody. So Yatundi, I believe the name. So go ahead. I think this is the last part because I actually have to go. And by the way, unfortunately, I won't be able to give the class on 40 Nawawi Hadith for today only. Because I'm actually not feeling very well. I know you're like, you talked all this and you're not feeling well. Alhamdulillah. Go ahead.
Now, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
Walaikum
barakatuh.
salam.
Yeah, I guess while you were talking right now, you said most of the questions I wanted to ask were what you said, my observation. So that was what I wanted to ask. But now my question is, how do one know which one to, because it gets so confusing, and there's so many misconceptions, you know. May Allah guide us, subhanallah. So many things. Some of us want to be, because we really get, you know, getting the right people to reach out to, and so many outbreak scholars, should I say, that are out
I
there.
totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. And that's why acquiring ilm, you know, your way to knowing what ilm is supposed to be is by you acquiring the ilm. You do your homework. You do your homework. Especially in the age of fitna, you have to do your homework. You have to learn yourself in order to identify who is qualified and who is not qualified to teach or even to guide me.
Mm.
So we have to do our homework too.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
yep, Sister Zainab, go ahead, Sister Zainab.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I pray to Allah, He give you a fast recovery that leave no illness.
Amen.
And sorry, like you being with us, like teaching us, even though you're not feeling well. So may Allah really reward you for that, and may Allah bless you and bless your health, and like always give us like the love to learn from you and the love to learn what Allah want us to learn and to take it and apply it as well too. I think for me, what I want to share today is we have to understand that we are in a time of fitna. As Sister Aisha was mentioning, the righteous scholars or the truthful scholars are being put in a spot that is putting them in a place where they have to choose between their life and speaking the truth. And we have to understand that we are in a time where no longer we can say talabul ilm is not mandatory on me. Okay, unfortunately, we reach a level when talabul ilm, seeking knowledge, is now mandatory in every single person, because that's the only way we can know who is the truthful scholar and who is not. And that's also the way that will help us when we are helping or supporting a scholar. We know that we are supporting the right ones and we're not falling in the trap of the shaitan and we're giving voice to the wrong person. So that this is the level now we reached. And in my observation on myself, on other people, I noticed one thing. The biggest enemy to us, woman, is not our husband, it's not our kids. I don't have kids, so someone can be like, oh, you have no right to say that. And absolutely, I understand that. It's not the economy, it's not the government, it's not whatever you want to call it outside. Our biggest enemy is ourselves. What do you say exactly to yourself? Do you say to yourself, oh, I can't do it because ta 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 ta? Or are you saying to yourself, I can do it, and with Allah help? Because all the stories that we heard and all the scholars we heard of today, they are moms, they are husbands. And back in the time, there is no such a thing as birth control. And still you will hear this story of this scholar just made me cry, that she is shaking her baby with one hand and writing with another hand. So la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. What else we have to say? So it's really changed that mindset, how you are speaking to yourself. What are you saying to yourself? And don't let the shaitan play you, because that's exactly his aim, to make you not believe in yourself. Believe in Allah. Ask Allah for help. Don't be like, well, I can't do nothing because this and this and that. No, say, oh Allah, you know how many kids I have, you know what type of husband I have, you know my situation economic, you know this, you know that. But I know one thing, if you help someone, you will split the ocean on two. And all I want is that you help me. Depend on Allah, don't depend on nobody else. And also another thing, we as Muslim women, we need to create a community we're helping each other. Like, I was shocked that Umar ibn al-Khattab, and correct me if I didn't get the right name, he used to take turn with another Sahabi on seeking knowledge. So one day he will be at work, and then the other day the other Sahabi will be learning from the Prophet ﷺ. And then they meet, they exchange the knowledge, and then they take the turn. So now Umar will go to seek the knowledge, and the other brother is doing his business. It's really about the mindset. Change your mindset, sisters. Change your mindset, sisters. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله. الله يبارك فيكي. الله يجزيك الخير يا ربي. الله يرضى عنك. And inshallah, I will see you all, not today, but maybe tomorrow, inshallah. But I really have to go to my doctor's appointment because I've been hurting for a couple of days now. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.